Okay, if you look on page 19 in your 4.6, 4.7 packet, we're going to go over some word problems. So this is page 19. And the first problem says the number of DVD players sold in the US from 1998 onward can be modeled by the equation f of x equals 1500x plus 500, where x is the number of years since 1998. They want us to graph the function and identify its domain and range. So when we graph this function, we're going to have to change the values of x and find out what values we get for f of x. So this helps us practice function notation. So to find f of 0, because remember, I'm going to replace x for 0, which means f of x becomes f of 0. And wherever I see x, I put a 0. So 1500 times 0 plus 500 equals 500. Now, if you want, you can just write the 500. You don't have to show the work, but I'm going to show the work for people who need to see it. So f of 1 would mean I plug in a 1 for x plus 500, and that's 1500 plus 500, that's 2000. And f of 2 would be 1500 times 2 plus 500, and that would be 3,500. And f of 3 would be 1,500 times 3 plus 500, and that would be 6,500. No, that would be 5,000, sorry. 4,500, 5,000, yeah. Okay, so now the next question says, find the value of x so that f of x equals 5,000. Well, obviously, when f of x equals 5,000, x equals 3. So one way to get that answer would be look at the chart and see if you already have it on the chart. So one way to do this answer is chart 5,000. Sorry, chart x equals 3 because f of 3 equals 5,000 according to the chart. Now, another way we could have done that is if f of x is 5,000, then I substitute 5,000 for f of x. And now I just solved this equation for x. And I get 4,500 equals 1,500x, divide by 1,500, divide by 1,500, and x equals 3. So one way is to use the chart. The second way is to use the equation. And the third way would be to use the graph. But we haven't graphed it yet. So let's go down and graph it. So when we graph this, I have it all set up for you. We know years always goes on the x-axis, and so everything else goes on the y. And when I go to graph this, I have when x is 0, y is 500. You can look at your paper because you can't see the chart here. When x is 1, y is 2,000. When x is 2, it's 3,500. When x is 3, it's 5,000. And 4 is 6,500. So when I graph this, that's what it looks like. Now, if the question said, find the value of x so that f of x is 5,000, what I could do is I could say, okay, here is when f of x is 5,000. I go over to the line and I come down and say, oh, that's when x is 3. So that's how you'd use the chart to answer that question. Now, the other question says, identify the domain and the range. Okay, so the domain would be all the possible x values. Well, one way to determine the possible x values is look at your graph. What is the minimum x value? The minimum x value is 0. And it continues forever, so 0 onward. How do we write that? We write that as x is greater than or equal to 0. Now, for the y values, what's the lowest y value? Well, the lowest y value is 500, and then it seems to go on forever. So I would say f of x is greater than or equal to 500. Or if you wrote y is greater than or equal to 500, that would be fine. And that's your domain and range. Now, let's look at our chart, and we can also get the same information from our chart. What is the minimum x value? It's 0. What's the minimum y value? It's 500. So from here, I could have said x is greater than or equal to 0, and y, or f of x, is greater than or equal to 500. So that would be another way of getting the domain and range. Okay, so now let's turn to page 20. And while I'm erasing this, you go ahead and read number 2 and think about how you would set that up. Okay, so this is page 20. And on page 20, it says a home security company charges new customers $150 for installations and a monthly fee of $50. This situation is modeled by that equation where M is the number of months and F of M is the cost over time. They want us to graph and identify the domain and range. So again, to graph this, I put my equation. I know M is the number of months, and months we would always start at 0. Because we're starting months at 0, months goes on the x-axis because it's time, and cost usually always goes on the y-axis. I count my cost by 50s, and we'll see why when we plug in our values, and my months by 1. So when I do f of 0, that's 50 times 0, which is 0, plus 150, so it's 150. Then I do f of 1, which means I plug in a 1 for M. 50 times 1 is 50, plus 150 is 200. Then f of 2, I plug in a 2 for M. That's 100 plus 150 is 250. F of 3, 3 times 50 is 150, plus 150 is 300. F of 4, 4 times 50 is 200, plus 150 is 350. And f of 5 is 250 plus 150, which is 400. So now I plot these points. And 0, 150, 1, 200, and I put my line. And it asks me to identify the domain and range. So remember, you either look at the graph or you look at the chart. We're going to look first at the chart. What's the minimum x value? It's 0. So that means x is greater than or equal to 0. What's the minimum y value or f of m value? It's 150. So that means y, or f of m, is greater than or equal to 150. Also notice here, when you look for the lowest x value, it's 0, and the lowest y value. So you look at the low point on the chart, y equals 150, x equals 0. That's also where you can get the minimum and maximum for your domain and range. Now, let's see what the next question asks. It says, to attract more customers, they're offering a special for the month of May of $50 installation, but you still have to pay $50 a month. The situation is modeled by the equation G of M equals 50M plus 50. Graph this new equation on the same coordinate plane, and how are these graphs related? Well, basically, the new amount, the new y amount is going to be 50 less each time, because instead of charging 150, we're only charging 50. So my new values would be 50. I'm going to subtract 150. I'm going to subtract 100, because the difference between 150 and 50 is 100. So this would be 100, this would be 150, this would be 200, this would be 250, and this would be 300. So when we graph the blue, we're here, 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 here. And because the lines are parallel, one is a translation of the other. So since the lines are parallel, we just shift down 100. So when the lines are parallel, that would be a translation. If the slopes change, that would either be a vertical stretch or a vertical shrink. Okay, so I'm going to erase this. You go ahead and look at number 3 and get ready to do number 3. Okay, so number 3 says, my gym membership is $20 a month. This is after paying a membership fee of $60 when I joined. This can be modeled by f of x equals 20x plus 60, where x is the number of months and f of x is total cost over time. Graph this function, identify the domain and range. Okay, so again, because time, months, always goes on the x-axis, I put the number of months on the x-axis, total cost on the y-axis. Okay. Now, I count my months by 1, and before I figure out, now I already showed you what I counted the costs by, but the way I came up with that is I plugged in numbers here. So let's plug in the numbers. When I plug in f of 0, I get 20 times 0 is 0, plus 60 is 60. F of 1, 20 times 1 is 20, plus 60 is 80. F of 2, 20 times 2 is 40, plus 60 is 100. F of 3, 20 times 3 is 60, plus 60 is 120. F of 4 is 20 times 4 is 80, plus 60 is 140. F of 5 is 100 plus 60 is 160. And f of 6 is 20 times 6 is 120, plus 60 is 180. Okay, now I plot these points. I get 0, 60. And I just connect it. Again, let's think about why this is array. okay? And it is a ray because can we have negative months? No. Can we have negative costs? No. So it can't exist anywhere but quadrant 1, which means this is an endpoint, okay? So if somebody was to draw a line, they would get points taken off. Now, let's think about what the domain and range is. There's two different ways for us to figure out the domain and range. One is let's look at the chart, and the chart will give us the minimum x and the minimum y. So we can say x has to be greater than or equal to 0, y, or f of x, has to be greater than or equal to 60. We can look at the graph. What's the minimum x? It's 0, because this end point is 0, 60. That tells us x minimum is 0, y's minimum is 60. So that's how we figure out the domain and range. Now, the next question says, find the value so f of x equals 180. Well, there was 3 ways to do that. One way is to look at the chart. You find 180. What was the x value that gave you 180? It was 6. So x equals 6. The second way is to look at the graph. Find 180 on the graph. Go down. What x value gave you 180? And it was 6. The third way is to use the equation and plug in 180 for f of x and solve for x. So I subtract 60 from both sides, and I get 120 equals 20x. And when I divide both by 20, x equals 6. So there were 3 different ways to get a value of x equals 6. Okay, and that's the end of this video.